Hey guys, here we are for chapter 4, section 2, evolution. Your essential question, pretty straightforward. Explain the process of evolution by natural selection. Every time we go into evolution, I always get some people say, I don't really believe in evolution. You know what? That's fine. Because we're going to talk about evolution for the most part from an aspect that almost everybody agrees with. Remember, the word evolution itself simply means change over time. And we see things change over time. A population of mice can go from being black and white spots, and we put them outside, and over a few generations, most of those mice tend to become brown furred mice, because they changed over time to adapt to their environment. Those that were born with a coloration shading that allowed them to hide survived and passed on that trait. And those that were fast survived and passed on that trait. Till 10 generations of mice later, which can be pretty quick with mice, I have primarily all brown or sandy colored mice living in the area. This is evolution. Change over time by slowly adapting to the environment. This is what we're going to address. This process of changing over time to adapt to the specific environment that an organism lives in. Charles Darwin is who is accredited this idea of evolution to. He and another man, but primarily we talk about Darwin. He observed that organisms in a population differed slightly from each other in their form, their function, and behavior. Let's take humans, something we're very familiar with. Although we're all human and we have 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 feet, all this stuff, there's a lot of variations in human. Some of us have red or really light hair, very light colored features, light colored eyes. Some of us are very dark skinned, dark eyes. Some of us have long straight hair. Some of us have curly hair. Some of us are tall. Some of us are short. You get the idea. It's all these little variations in a population that allows it to adapt to possible change. Now, some of these differences are heredity. Some of my behaviors are just me. I run triathlons, races. I like to do that. I can't really pass that on. I could pass on some of my athletic ability, the fact that I'm tall or have long legs and maybe have a good VO2 max, but I can't pass on being a triathlete to my children. It's not a hereditary thing. My hair color, my eye color, my bone structure, my right-handedness versus left-hand, all of these can be passed on. They're heredity. So Darwin proposed that the environment exerts a strong influence over which individuals survive to produce. And some individuals, because of certain traits, are more likely to reproduce than others. This was his idea. He said, turtles over here, all the food is kind of high up on shrubs and bushes, so the turtles that are born really short have a hard time getting food. Turtles that happen to be born a little taller have an advantage. They live longer, have turtle sex more often, and reproduce more turtles that are slightly taller. Over time, I tend to find taller turtles on this island as opposed to somewhere else where there was a lot of grass and food was abundant. Let's look at this chart up here that talks about evolution by natural selection. Now, he has several premises, things that we're going to think through. Number one, he says individuals in a population can vary in each generation. You and your brother or sister probably don't look exactly alike. There are some variances. Some of these variations are genetic. They're inherited. You got it from your mom and your dad. Sometimes you look at it and say, yeah, I have my mom's hands. I have my dad's nose. Some of these traits are passed on. More individuals are produced than live to grow up and reproduce. Now with humans, for the most of us, make it all the way to adulthood to reproduce, but not all of us. And in a general population, We replace more than just ourselves. Most people produce more than just two, if it's a couple, two children. And especially in something, say, like sea turtles, it lays 400 eggs. Well, not many of those sea turtles make it to adulthood. Or dogs in a litter get born. Not all of those dogs in the wild make it to adulthood. So that's what we mean by more individuals are produced than live to grow up and reproduce. So some selection can take place. Those best adapted to survive do. Those least adapted to survive die, or don't live long enough to reproduce very often, and their genes don't make it into the larger pool as much. Fourth, individuals with some genes are more likely to survive than others. If you're a fish and you happen to be able to swim faster than your other fish, odds of you escaping is better, and you can pass on that trait. You happen to be born with a deformed fin like Nemo. Well, Nemo probably wouldn't really make it to adulthood because he's going to be a little slower than the other fish of his type and get eaten, as a general rule. So those are the four premises, and the conclusion is this. Based on those four premises, individuals with genetic traits that make them more likely to grow up and reproduce in the existing environment, whatever environment they're born into, will become more common in the population from one generation to the next. So I released my black and white mice into the field because I don't want to keep them anymore. It's not a good idea. Don't do it. But hypothetically, when those mice, they have black and white genes, when they breed, some of them wind up being a little more brown and white. Those are able to hide better. They pass on this brownish coloring, and in time, these very minor adaptations, the ones born lucky enough to blend into their environment by random chance, survive longer, reproduce more often, and I have more of that type mouse out in the field in time. This is evolution. It's a long process. It's not overnight. I can't decide to do it. Nature selects. Darwin thought that nature selects for certain traits, such as sharper claws, because an organism with sharper claws is more likely to survive. It can catch its prey easier, what have you. Over time, the population is going to include more and more individuals with the beneficial trait. And as the populations of a given species change, the entire species can change over time. Nature selects. I'm saying nature is the driving force behind that. An example of this, I've thrown in some along the way, but the book example is deer that become isolated. Now, deer are migratory animals. They will follow the food. So let's say we have some deer that live here around North Florida. Well, they begin to follow some food, and they follow some food up out of Florida, up into Georgia, and then with global warming, it stays a little warmer. They tend to stay in Georgia. They don't come all the way back. And then next season, they follow their food up. Well, these deer find themselves up in Tennessee after a couple of generations, where it's much colder. Now, by sheer chance, some of these deer had slightly longer fur, some of them had shorter fur, and most had the shorter fur that lived down here in Florida. But when they moved up north and it got cold, the ones with the short fur tended to die quicker. We lost more short-furred deer in the winter than long-furred deer. The long-furred deer had an advantage. They survived and they reproduced. So the next year I have fewer short-haired deer and I get a little more long-haired deer. The next year, more of the short-haired deer die off and the long-haired deer are the ones doing the more reproducing. And in time, the population shifts from in Florida, mainly short-haired deer, to in Tennessee, mainly long-haired deer. This is an adaptation. They were more likely to survive. They survive to adulthood, reproduce more often, and that trait becomes predominant in that population of deer. Adaptation is just this process of becoming adapted to your environment. It is anatomical, in this case it was fur, can be physiological, and it can be a behavioral change. I talk about behavioral, the lizards around here, they run, stop, run, stop. Well, this is a behavior, if you will. By running and stopping, a bird trying to swoop down and misses them because the bird's planning where it's going to be and the lizard abruptly stops at random intervals. Well, that behavior can allow the lizard to survive, as opposed to the lizard that just runs the whole time. Birds can pick it off easier. So adaptations, they can be anatomical, they can be physiological, coloring, something of this nature, or behavioral, but anything that improves its ability to survive benefits the animal. We also have something called coevolution. This is a process where two species evolving in response to long-term interactions with each other evolve together. One organism, typically this happens where we have some sort of symbiotic relationship. One is feeding off of the other, or the two are mutually compatible for some reason, but in some symbiotic relationship where one is dependent on the other for some odd thing, they can co-evolve. The example we're going to bring up is the honey creeper. So up here we see the honey creeper. It's got this long curved beak to reach the nectar at a base of a type of flower. Now the flower has structures that ensures the bird gets some pollen on its head. So it's after the nectar at the base of this, so the bird has to stick its head way in there and some of the pollen gets on its face. And then the bird flies over to another honey creeper and shoves its face in there and the pollen falls off to pollinate the next flower. Well, this flower had kind of started developing a deeper and deeper well, if you will, and the honey creeper, the ones born with a slightly longer beak, had an advantage to get the food. Other birds can't get it from this flower, so it's a niche. It allowed them to survive. They didn't have to compete with every other bird going after these other flowers. They just went after the flower. And as that flower got a longer and longer stem, the birds over time with longer beaks adapted, and this is a coevolution process. The flower is now dependent on that type of bird to do its pollination for it, and that bird largely exists off of these flowers, so it's not in competition with all of the others. The plant has two different adaptations, the nectar, which is what the bird wants, and then the structure that puts the pollen on its face. Both of these have to be in accordance or it doesn't really work. So coevolution is where two organisms wind up evolving together over time. Now, evolution by artificial selection. Now, in reality, artificial selection is what gave Darwin the idea for natural selection. Darwin raised pigeons as a hobby, like somebody might raise dogs as a hobby. And he would crossbreed them. He said, ooh, there's a pigeon with really interesting feathers on its feet. And he would find another pigeon with really interesting feathers on its feet and breed them. And the babies that had these interesting feathers, he'd keep, and the others he would sell or eat, whatever the heck he did with them. And over time, he would have these breed of pigeons that had these really feathered feet, and he could sell them. Or he'd say, ooh, that one has a particularly interesting coloring around its eyes. And he would artificially breed them. He was making the selection, not nature, but Darwin. So artificial selection is breeding of organisms by humans for their specific desirable traits. Dogs. Dogs all came from either wolves or dingoes. Now, my dog, which is some sort of beagle mutt mix, doesn't look anything like a wolf. Maybe a bit like a dingo. But we found wolves, and somebody wanted a curly-haired wolf. So they took wolf with a little more wavy hair, a little more wavy, bred it, got the one only with wavy hair, bred it with another with wavy hair, until eventually we get something, say, like a poodle with this very curly hair. That is artificial selection. We have also done this with fruit. grains, vegetables, etc. I'm a farmer and I'm growing my food, and corn will have some slight adaptations just like humans. Different sizes, different height. Well, corn that happened to grow a particularly large head, we kept those for seed for next year. Or this corn happened to taste particularly sweet. Let's keep some of it and we'll plant it next year. And that's what we've done with our fruits and grains. Most of what we eat has been evolved by artificial selection of farmers for eons, because we've been doing this virtually forever with it. Then we come to resistance, the evolution of resistance. Resistance itself is the ability of an organism to tolerate a chemical or some kind of disease-causing agent. It may simply be that this organism carries a gene that breaks the chemical down into a harmless substance. Let me take a for instance. It's almost the other way. Most people can eat peanuts, no problem. They eat their nuts, they enjoy the nuts, and it's all good. But some people eat the peanut and they get an allergic reaction. They can actually die from eating peanuts. In this sense, they lack the gene that allows them to process the peanut. So in the same way, in a population of, let's say, grasshoppers, I go out and I spray my field for grasshoppers because they're eating all of my corn, and most of the grasshoppers die. But a few of them happen to have a gene that renders that chemical harmless in their body. It doesn't kill them. Well, now, what is the population of grasshoppers in my field? Most of the grasshoppers died off, but the grasshoppers that are alive in that field are the ones that are resistant. And who are they going to have grasshopper sex with? Yeah, other grasshoppers in my field. And those grasshoppers reproduce and they pass on that trait. Now, not all of their offspring have it, but a lot of them do. And next year I have grasshoppers again, I spray, but maybe only half of them die this year. And those grasshoppers all have this gene that renders the poison non-toxic to them, and they reproduce, and I spray next year, and it doesn't even look like the spray is working, because now I have a population of grasshoppers that are resistant to insecticide A. And now I got to go find some other chemical to try and kill them. This is the evolution of resistance. And humans are promoting evolution of resistant populations by trying to control pests and or bacteria with chemicals. Right now we're using a hand sanitizer to clean our hands. It kills 99.9% of the bacteria. So what bacteria is left in our hand? The bacteria that it doesn't kill. And we tend to make bacteria that winds up being resistant to a particular type of hand sanitizer. This is the evolution of resistance, and right now it is largely being driven by humans putting chemicals on, whether it's bacteria, flowers, corn, etc. And our insects are adapting, not because they're trying to, they just simply happen to be born in a way that allows them to not be affected by it. So, pesticide resistance is what this is. So we have resistance in general, but specifically pesticide resistance is just that, where a pest becomes resistant to this particular type of chemical. That is it for evolution, kind of short in a nutshell. Take care, and we will see you next time.